Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us bright and early on this beautiful fall day. This is the first Wake Up with Research event for spring since spring 2023. So it's exciting to be back with all of you. And I know we have a lot of familiar faces out there on YouTube that's been joining us for all of our events. Thank you so much for joining us again, and welcome to any folks that are new to watching Wake Up with Research here. I'm Celestina Barbosa-Laker, Professor and Executive Vice Chancellor here at Washington State University Health Sciences Spokane. I'm here on our WSU Spokane campus, and I'm happy to report that things are busy and active here with our students who are nearly halfway through this semester. The campus has been embarking on a lot of projects and growth. About 8 weeks ago, we had more than 300 guests join us for the opening of our medicine building here on campus, which is a huge highlight for our community and also for the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine. We look forward to more exciting events this spring, such as our annual STEER lecture, our Inland Northwest Research Symposium, and of course, our spring Wake Up with Research event. So please watch your email for more details. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we started this research series in about 2021 to share and highlight our research with community members. We did this virtually first during the pandemic, and we learned that many people liked this early morning format. And because of that, we decided to keep some of this series virtually, but then also some of this in person. Our goal is to provide you with an opportunity to learn more about the research that is happening not only here in Spokane, but across the entire state of Washington and beyond. Our researchers are making very important contributions in so many different fields. Studies of research range from sleep and performance, which you'll hear about this morning, to addictions, cancer, chronic disease, and neurological diseases, and so much more. All of this research is looking at complex and life-changing problems that will ultimately enrich the quality of life for all of us. Today, I would like to recognize one of our very special partners. We are very privileged to have Alaska Airlines as our sponsor for today's Wake Up with Research. Alaska Airlines is a huge partner with Washington State University in many capacities, so we're excited to have them on board with us to sponsor this series. Joining us today is Joelle Nelson, Community Relations Manager with Alaska Airlines. Welcome, Joelle.
Thank you, Celestina. My name is Joelle Nelson, and I'm so proud to be here on behalf of Alaska Airlines. Every day, WSU families, their students, faculty are flying across the state and using Alaska Airlines. We just recently announced and launched a new Go Cougs aircraft with WSU. And so we're pleased to see that plane up in the skies and promoting WSU. Additionally, we support a lot of research, and one of the areas at WSU we support is sustainable aviation fuel, in the hopes that sustainable aviation fuel will make flying more sustainable. Additionally, we're pleased to support series like Wake Up with Research, and I think we'll learn more today about how this research is connected to air travel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joelle. I got to fly in that Go Cougs plane. It was the highlight, honestly. It was so awesome. What a great aircraft. Well, thank you so much. And we're so grateful for your support and partnership with the Washington State University community. Also, about 60 of you this morning received a very nice complimentary breakfast box as part of this morning series, which again is courtesy of Alaska Airlines, so thank you. And 2 of our guests will be entered to win an Alaska Airlines ticket voucher. So if you fill out a survey after today's presentation, you'll hear a little bit more about that. So keep an eye out on your email for a survey later this week. And so thank you very much again to our sponsor this morning, Alaska Airlines. To start, I want to start with an acknowledgement of America's First Peoples. Washington State University acknowledges that its locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who have lived in this region from time immemorial. The university expresses its deepest respect for and gratitude towards these original and current caretakers of the region. As an academic community, we acknowledge our responsibility to establish and maintain relationships with these tribes and Native peoples in support of tribal sovereignty and the inclusion of their voices in teaching, research, and academic programming. I also want to touch on what got us here. Washington State University is a land-grant university, and the way that we serve our state in the health sciences is through education of the state's future workforce, service to communities and organizations that serve our healthcare needs, and research that works to improve the health and well-being of every resident in the state of Washington. Referencing the statewide approach, we note that WSU Health Sciences research is being done across the state of Washington and beyond. In looking at this slide, you can see all of our clinical sites and partnerships across the state in both rural and urban settings. Okay, let's jump into then today's program and hear from these amazing researchers who are ready to share some fantastic information with you all this morning. I want to remind all of you that you can submit questions here over YouTube in the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll be monitoring them as they come in. So no need to hold off to the very end. You can submit your questions at any time, and then we'll have our presenters answer them live here towards the end. We have 4 presenters today, and we're going to start things off with Dr. Hans van Dongen. Dr. van Dongen is the director of the Sleep and Performance Research Center and a professor in the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine. And his research focuses on the effects of sleep and sleep deprivation on cognitive functions. Over to you, Hans.
Thank you very much, Celestina, and good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen here and see if we can get that started. So, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society jointly recommend that adults should sleep 7 or more hours per night on a regular basis to promote optimal health. They say that sleeping less than 7 hours per night on a regular basis is associated with adverse health outcomes, including weight gain and obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease and stroke, depression, and the increased risk of death. They also say that sleeping less than 7 hours per night is associated with impaired immune function, increased pain, impaired performance, increased errors, and greater risk of accidents. So, as you can tell, if you don't sleep enough on a regular basis, you might be in for some trouble. Now, I can reassure you that if you just in a once-off didn't get enough sleep, like maybe tomorrow, this morning you got up a little early to attend this session, you're probably going to be okay. But in the long run, if you don't sleep enough, bad things might happen. And one of the first things you might notice is that your attention starts to wane, that you are starting to get difficulty sustaining your attention when you're doing a task. We can show this in the lab pretty easily with the reaction time task. It's called the psychomotor vigilance test. People are looking at a screen for 10 minutes and pressing a button simply when they're seeing something on the screen appear and just acknowledging that they saw it. And when somebody does that, when they're not sleep deprived, when they're healthy, they're alert, and they're well rested, they produce reaction times in this graph here in blue that are in the order of 250 milliseconds, maybe 300 milliseconds, pretty consistently. And so that's what a healthy, young, well-rested brain looks like. Very steady, very fast performance. But if you look at that same brain 24 hours later in this sort of pinkish salmon-colored diagram here, now all of a sudden we see that some of these reaction times, some of these bars in this diagram are much, much longer. And there are reaction times here seemingly out of nowhere that are more than a second long. That's the kind of thing that happens when you're on the highway and all of a sudden you realize that you missed your exit and you're like, what just happened? You missed something, right? So that's what an unstable brain looks like. And that's what sleep deprivation will do to your brain. It will make your brain unstable, and therefore you will start to miss pieces of information that might be important to you. And that, of course, could be a risk issue in daily life. It's not the only thing that goes wrong when you're sleep deprived. Here's another task that we ask people to do in our lab on the campus here in Spokane, on the WSU campus, when they're in our lab, and we ask them to learn a number of numbers that we give them that are either stimuli that they're supposed to respond to, like the number 42 in this little diagram here. If they see that appear on the screen, they're supposed to press a button. But if they see a different number, like let's say 69 or so, then they're not supposed to press a button. we're not telling them in advance which is which, but we'll tell them if they got it right or wrong. And so as they do the task, they will learn which number is which, right? And so it's a learning task. But then we throw a wrench into this whole thing, and we actually reverse the contingencies. And we don't tell them this, but all of a sudden 42 is no longer the number you should respond to, but it becomes the number you should no longer respond to. And of course, now the computer will tell you that actually that number is wrong when you respond. And you're supposed to take that feedback and realize that something has changed. Something has changed, and your actions that you set out to do are no longer relevant. This is very common in day-to-day situations too, when all of a sudden something unexpected happens, and now you have to adjust. And it turns out that sleep deprivation impairs that ability to adjust to unexpected changes in the circumstances. In other words, what sleep deprivation will do, it will limit your ability to be cognitively flexible, and you become what we call perseverative. You start to continue to do what you were doing previously, even though it's no longer relevant to the situation at hand. And so you can pretty much imagine that is also in daily life can be a tricky issue to deal with, right? But not everybody needs the same amount of sleep. We can test this in our lab pretty easily too. What we can do is we can keep people in the lab for multiple days in a row, and we can ask them to just get as much sleep as they possibly can, so that they're fully well rested. And we've done that with people who were in the lab 3 times, and each time they were given 12 hours time for sleep, which is plenty of time for most people to completely recuperate and recover their sleep need. What we find is that some people, like these individuals here on the left, sleep about 7 or 8 hours consistently, and that's enough for them. They just wake up naturally, and that's what they need, and it doesn't really matter. They don't get any more. These are 3 instances when the same individual slept just about 7 hours or so, and it doesn't get any more than that. They just don't need any more. But there's other people, same age category, young adults to middle age, that need a lot more sleep, about 10 hours or so. And again, consistently, they need that same amount of sleep. So the sleep need of these individuals, very consistent within a person, but very different from one person to another, right? And unfortunately, it usually isn't the people that think they need very little sleep that are also really the ones that do need little sleep. But the amount of sleep you need is not the only variable that matters. We also need to think about the timing of sleep. And so you're probably well aware that some people just like to get up early, and they're fresh and wide open eyes early in the morning, and other people have more trouble getting up in the morning, but they do really well in the afternoon and in the evening hours. And so when we look at these people's body temperature rhythms in this diagram here, that's a 24-hour rhythm. That is a beautiful representation of what our biological clock is doing. We can measure that very carefully in our lab. And when we do that, we see that the 24-hour rhythm of the biological clock as measured by body temperature is different between morning and evening type individuals. And there's actually a timing difference of more than 2 hours. So the biological clock of evening type people runs about more than 2 hours later than the biological clock of morning type people. So that means that if you're a rise and shine person, an early type or lark, that is a biological feature. That is something that your biological clock makes you do. But if you're a rise and wine person like myself, who doesn't really like to get up this early, then that is also a biological feature, right? That is part of my biological clock, and that makes me different from people that are morning types. So this is also a feature that we have to recognize. People are not the same in this regard. And then, to make matters more complicated, what happens when people are sleep deprived and when they do not get enough sleep also varies from one person to another. We see this in this diagram where you had people in the lab, again, 3 times, but now we were sleep depriving them. We gave them 36 hours of sleep deprivation, which is basically skipping a whole night and then testing their performance the next day. And we see performance impairment consistently in everybody, but not everybody has the same amount of performance impairment when you're sleep deprived. We did the test 3 times, twice it was exactly the same, but the 3rd time, we actually asked people to sleep deprive themselves before they even came to the lab. So they were already tired before we even started the experiment. And nonetheless, we saw that some individuals, like these people here on the left, every time they came to the lab, had very relatively good performance and didn't suffer much of the consequences of sleep loss. Even when they were already pre-sleep deprived, it didn't matter all that much. But there were also people who really fell apart very quickly after a night of sleep deprivation every time. And again, this was something that kept happening to them. It was a trait. It was something that was part of their biology. And so they were vulnerable or resilient to the effects of sleep loss based on who they were. And once again, unfortunately, those people who think that they do well with sleep deprivation weren't necessarily the ones who actually did well with sleep deprivation. So this has direct consequences for the real world. I'll give you one example. This is a study from that we did with Air Force pilots. So the Air Force pilots, as you of course know, are highly selected, highly skilled, highly trained individuals who might run night missions, and they practice these things. They practice these in this flight simulator of a F-117A or a Nighthawk stealth fighter jet. It's not currently in use anymore, but at the time of this study, that was a plane that the US used a lot. And so these pilots, to make sure that they were up and current on their flight certification for long duration night missions, used the simulator. And then they were flying these complicated maneuvers in this flight simulator to see if they were still really sharp on their skills. And they did this in a simulated night mission that started at 11 p.m. and then went into the night, 4 a.m., 9 a.m. So now we're in the next morning, and then into the afternoon. And this one pilot here, number 2, really didn't sustain any deficits during this whole mission. That person retained their flight path really carefully, did really well on these tasks, all the way through this night and mission into the next day. But this other pilot really started to do more poorly in the night and then in the early morning hours. And it wasn't until in the afternoon, when the biological clock of this person came to the rescue, that they started to do better again. So remember, these are highly skilled, highly selected, highly trained professionals, basically the same in every other category, but yet they respond differently to the effects of sleep loss. So you can imagine that if Air Force pilots face this problem, then so do everybody else, right? And so this has direct implications for other fields of research, but also other fields in our actual daily lives, such as transportation. I'm thinking, of course, about aviation. I'm thinking about trucking. I'm thinking about people who keep stores and offices open at night, but also people that keep the electricity on at night. All of these people face the same issues. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I have said enough for today. So I'm turning it back to Celestina. Other than to say that if you want to like to know more about this, here's my contact information. And thank you all for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Hans. Thanks for sharing that. That is great. Very, very fascinating research. And we've got a lot of questions coming in from YouTube already. So keep them coming to the viewers, and we'll make sure that everyone has time to answer them. We are going to keep things up in the skies, so to speak, here with our next presenter, Dr. Amanda Lamb. Dr. Lamb is an assistant research professor at the Sleep and Performance Research Center at Washington State University. Her research focuses on occupational sleep medicine, specific to sleep and performance in real-world operations such as commercial aviation and transportation. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Celestina. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Give me a second to pull up my slides. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, so I am here today to talk to you about measuring sleep in the friendly skies. Okay, so why do we measure sleep in commercial airline pilots? Well, greater than 1 billion US passengers travel by air. It's a lot of individuals. Additionally, our corporate partner maintains the world's most comprehensive route network with over 4,500 flights per day. Therefore, it is imperative that we keep our pilots alert with optimum cognitive performance for both the safety of the flight crew and our traveling public. All right, so we use primarily 3 safety performance indicators, what we call our SPIs. That's our actigraph. I think it's on your left. So that's a wrist-worn activity monitor, and that is used to measure sleep. It is used continuously throughout the data collection period. We actually start before the trips and end after the trips. And that is also verified by the pilot's sleep work logbook. It's like a study diary. Also, additionally, here you see these scales. So you have your Sam Perelli fatigue scale, and that is from 1 to 7. Then you have your Karolinska sleepiness scale, that is from 1 to 9. And these are well-validated scales that we use. Also, Hans spoke about the PVT, psychomotor vigilance task. It is a reaction time test, but whereas in the lab they do 10 minutes, we in the field do the 5-minute test. And that is to measure the speed with which the pilot reacts to a stimulus. Okay, so using these safety performance indicators, our SPIs, we have actually amassed a large amount of data with our corporate partner. And I just have a few examples to highlight how we have impacted safety. And so we're going to start with, this is verifying alertness. Our team verifies the alertness levels of pilots flying, so non-compliant flight operations. And so what that means, non-compliant means that they do not fit within the regulatory envelope. And this is due to some sort of factor. A good example of a factor is that it actually exceeds the flight and duty time limits. These are what we call the table C limits. And this is because with aircraft flying longer than ever before, the regulators actually didn't anticipate that they would be able to go past those limits. So what you have to do is you have to show under what's called a fatigue risk management system data collection exemption, so an FRMS exemption, that flight is actually safe to fly. And so this is a really nice way for the airlines to show in a data-driven, evidence-based way that these can be flown and very successfully with alertness. We actually have 23 routes that we are currently studying for these FRMS exemptions. And through proper fatigue prevention and mitigation strategies, we have actually been able to show that all of these routes that we are currently studying are actually safe to fly. All right, then we have our better in-flight sleep timing. This is actually for 3 pilot crews, and it now allows them to choose the timing of their in-flight sleep for optimum sleep and cognitive performance. And so I don't know if everybody knows, but we actually are able to have our pilots sleep in flight. They have rest facilities. So with 3 pilot crews, they actually have 1 crew member. So the 2 will be obviously operating the aircraft. And then you have the 3rd that goes back to the rest facility and has an opportunity for sleep, which is quite nice. And so currently the regulations state that the landing pilot, so the pilot that is actually landing the aircraft, has to take the 3rd, which is the last sleep break. But in collaboration with our friends at NASA in the fatigue countermeasures lab, we have actually been able to show that the regulations do not allow pilots to choose the best timing for their in-flight sleep for their alertness. And therefore, the FAA has actually provided an exemption so that the pilots have the flexibility to choose the best in-flight sleep timing to ensure that when they are landing the aircraft, they can be fully alert and have their cognitive performance quite high. Then we have our modified routes. So this is along with ensuring our non-compliant flights are safe. We actually also have been able to show that some compliant flights need some modification. And this is just to increase safety, of course. So a good case is Manila-Koror. This is a compliant route that we are using to compare against a non-compliant route. While we did show that the compliant route was safe to fly, what we found was that it would be better to actually split up the compliant route, so Manila-Koror, to increase alertness for those pilots. And then thankfully that modification was done right away. Lastly, we have our expanded rescue strategies, and this is based on evidence from our data collection. So this is actually now we have 4 pilot crews. This is long range and ultra long range. Long range is 8 to 16 hours. Ultra long range, the longest that you can do are 16 plus. And we want to increase the in-flight sleep and subsequent alertness. So of course, since sleep is a strong predictor of performance, it's very important to quantify total in-flight sleep and determine rescue patterns that optimize the sleep opportunity of the crew. So interestingly, unlike prior findings, our data demonstrated that crews on long-range flights actually can get up to 3.7 hours of total in-flight sleep. And our ULR, or ultra long-range crews, can actually get about 4.7 hours of total in-flight sleep. And then we have these individual, what we term as super sleepers, that they were actually able to sleep up to 8 hours in flight, which is a little bit mind-blowing, honestly. We also found that although some crews do like the 4-break rest schemes, because there's different rest schemes that they can do. You can split into 2 or into 3 or 4. And past literature has kind of shown that 4 may be a good way to go, but they also didn't get the same sleep durations that we were getting. And so what we actually found is that though some did use the 4-break, really they preferred the simpler 2 and 3-break rest schemes. And that's really nice because that actually increases the sleep duration in flight and allows for increased subsequent alertness. So therefore, based on our evidence, the pilots were able to actually modify their strategies. And again, that increased that in-flight sleep and subsequent alertness. And I just want to acknowledge and thank our occupational sleep medicine group team members, of course, our airline partner, union representatives, and pilot participants. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks for sharing that great research. And I'm learning a whole lot. I know the viewers are as well. And we've got tons of questions coming in. This is going to be a great Q&A panel. We will get to that in just a little bit. Next up, we have Dr. Lois James. She is an associate professor and the assistant dean for research in WSU's College of Nursing. Dr. James studies the relationship between sleep, health, and performance in police officers, nurses, top-tier athletes, and others. Thank you so much, Lois, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Celestina. I'm so happy to be here. I will just share my screen. Super. So I'm just today going to give a very brief overview of the type of work that we do. And of course, it kind of follows the principles that have been discussed thus far of fatigue, sleep restriction, and circadian disruption, which essentially means being awake when your body wants to be asleep and having to work when you prefer to be sleeping. So these are the types of groups that we work with. We work a lot with the first responder community, so police officers, firefighters. We work with other public safety, so Department of Corrections, for example. I've worked with top-tier athletes at the college level, at the pro or national level, and at the Olympic level. And then we do a lot of work with military groups as well. So just to dig into what some of that looks like and what some of our results have been. So with our work with athletes, predominantly what I've done is fatigue and jet lag management plans for athletes who travel. So what this looks like, for example, I worked closely in the 2014 Winter Olympics that were in Sochi. I worked with a number of Canadian teams that were traveling, and really worked closely with their coaches, with their nutritionists, their psychologists, the entire athlete care support team to advise them on, what they should be doing in terms of prep, what they should be doing on the flight, what they should be doing when they land, and so on. And this is very straightforward in some cases because there are many athletic teams, of course, that can travel and stage, for a couple of weeks beforehand. So, for example, I worked with curling, and they were able to get to Sochi about 10 days before their first competition started. And this, as you can imagine, is quite an effective way of doing things because, it gives the body enough time to recover from jet lag, which is that feeling, that disruption when you move to a different time zone and your body needs to adjust to that time zone. And typically, it takes about a day per hour difference to really kind of adjust So that worked well for that team, and we could follow a fairly straightforward plan. However, I also worked with the Canadian hockey team, and of course they have NHL requirements. They were actually competing in continental in North America about 3 days before their first game, their first Olympic game. So we had to be quite creative in that sense of, okay, well, how do we get them, in this very short time period acclimated? So thankfully, because their games are typically at night, we actually kept them on quite a night owl schedule for the first period of almost a week. Which took some convincing on the part of the coaches that no, you don't want to get your athletes up at first thing in the morning. You have to let them sleep until about 2 p.m. But it did work out. It did work out well. Certainly anecdotally, I mean, they won the gold. They seemed like they were quite successful. And what these plans really look like, when I talk about these kind of jet lag management plans, it's a combination of light therapy, which is exposure and avoidance. It's some use, of course, very much, in coordination with their team physicians. It's some use of medication. It's some use of melatonin. And then it's a lot to do with hydration, nutrition. One of the major symptoms of jet lag is gastrointestinal upset. So kind of managing that as well. And then, of course, strategic use of napping. When are you sleeping? When are you waking up? Other teams that we've worked with at the collegiate level, we worked very closely with Gonzaga in the I think it was the 2016 year, the year that they got to the final, and worked closely with them around trying to promote and improve their sleep pattern. So we did a lot of education with that team, and then various NFL and other kind of pro teams as well. It's fun work working with athletes. Another group that I wanted to highlight here today, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them, but this is another occupational group that we've worked very, very closely with, are police officers. And a lot of this is in lab work. The lab that Hans was talking about also has a simulation lab where we can bring people in and we can test them on various different simulated tasks. And this is a really useful way of understanding the effects of fatigue, the effects of shift work, for example, on some of the tasks that are a little bit tricky to monitor or measure in the field. For example, use of force. So we can create scenarios that are very realistic that we can use then as a proxy for understanding A, the limits of human performance, and B, what are the types of things that increase the likelihood of mistakes, which of course the profession and communities alike are very concerned about. So the various tasks that we've really focused on when we look at police officers are driving safety. So safety of the officer themselves and also everybody else on the road that could potentially be involved in a collision if an officer falls asleep at the wheel, which is an alarmingly high occurrence. And then use of force as well. And one of the things that we find, especially with use of force, is that circadian disruption, which essentially in this case means officers working the night shift. So being working when their bodies want to sleep, and then of course having to sleep at some point during the day when their body's saying, hey, the sun's up, it's time to be up and about and awake. We find that the officers who are tested on the night shift who are quite fatigued actually have a decreased reaction time to shoot, which might sound strange and seems almost a little bit counter to what Hans was talking about with increased reaction times. But what we speculate and what we've kind of really digging into now is the possibility or the likelihood that this actually speaks to a lower decision-making threshold for decision to shoot. When somebody is very tired, they need, when an officer is more tired, they need less evidence to make that decision. And of course, this increases the risk of errors. In this case, errors being shooting somebody that you shouldn't, shooting somebody that is not armed, or not shooting somebody that you should. So in the simulated session, the officer not shooting and the actor on screen shooting them. Pivoting from policing to another occupational group, also shift working group that I work with very closely, are nurses. And I just wanted to just briefly dig into some of the data from a recent study, which actually followed quite a similar format to our big lab-based policing study, whereby we brought nurses in to the lab, in this case to the nursing simulation lab, and then also to the Sleep Performance Research Center to test them in driving simulators. But we brought nurses in on 2 separate occasions. One immediately following a 3rd consecutive 12-hour shift at a local hospital, and then once after a 3rd consecutive day off. So trying to test them at their kind of arguably their most fatigued and their most rested from a field or working perspective. We tested nurses who worked the day shift, which is 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and then also those that worked the night shift, which is 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And we saw various things. So this graph on the left is the predicted cognitive effectiveness or performance score and alertness score that we get from wrist actigraphy, which is a device for measuring sleep. And you can see in the green bars are the day shift. And you can see, if you look closely, you can see the percentages over on the left-hand side. So you can see the green bars across the hours of the shift, all the way from the 1st hour to the 12th hour, are kind of staying up and above that 90% cognitive effectiveness range, which is really great. You know, they're maintaining alertness for the most part. Now, there is individual variation for sure, but most of our day shift nurses are really not seeing a ton of fluctuation in their cognitive ability. And where this is important, if you look down the right-hand side of that graph, you'll see BAC or blood alcohol content, because this has been connected to level of blood alcohol content in the extent that it predicts collision, for example. So you can see that in that kind of 90% and up range, there's really not much in the way of risk. However, when you drop down into that yellow bar, you're looking at about a 0.05 equivalent for blood alcohol content. And when you drop down into that red bar, you're looking at a greater than 0.08, which is legally drunk. And you can see when you look at the red bars, which are the night shift nurses, you can see that although they're starting quite high, they're starting really well, they're slowly and then increasingly quickly starting to move into that danger zone when it comes to cognitive effectiveness. And this really shows the effects of working at a time when the body doesn't want to work, when it wants to be asleep. And this really speaks to the importance of fatigue management strategies, things like strategic napping, variety of other techniques that are really important to try and protect these night shift nurses and to protect their patients. On the right, you can see just a small diagram which shows that our night shift nurses were not only at kind of increased risk of collision when we tested them in the driving simulator, they were also impaired in their performance on nursing simulation tasks. And when we dug into this and really considered what that meant, we found that that most nurses were actually quite resistant to the more automated tasks. You know, the kind of the medication calculations, which is great, the, kind of observing and assessing, and they weren't typically missing any major cues. Where performance was really impaired was in communication with the patient, development of therapeutic relationship, patient-clinician relationship. You know, those were the areas where we really saw that our night shift nurses and our nurses who were more fatigued were suffering. With that, I'll pause just for a moment to give people a chance to take a look. If you want more information, please don't hesitate to email me. And thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much, Lois. That was so great. Super, super fascinating research. Thank you for being here with us this morning. Our final presenter this morning is Dr. Lonnie Nelson. Dr. Nelson is the co-director of Partnerships for Native Health here at WSU, as well as an associate professor and the new department chair of Nursing and System Science. His research focuses on neurocognitive assessment and rehabilitation interventions for people with brain injury. His additional research interest focuses on the elimination of health disparities in American Indian and Alaska Native populations, specifically those living in urban areas. Thanks so much, Lonnie, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Celestina. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the studies that I conducted actually in reservation communities as opposed to urban environment. The NIH, the National Institutes of Health, awarded us a grant to look at sleep deficiencies in American Indian people and evaluate their association with risk factors for chronic disease, as most chronic diseases are much more prevalent in the Native community than in the dominant population. So we proposed a mixed method study. So that means that we use both qualitative and quantitative measures to be carried out in 3 phases. The first phase, we were planning to conduct 5 focus groups with about 12 people in each, and 2 rounds of key informant interviews from 5 people in each of 3 Native communities, 1 in the Northern Plains, 1 in the Southern Plains, and 1 in the Southwest, representing a total of 10 tribes altogether. The goal was to identify factors representing barriers to and facilitators of good sleep in these communities. We developed a patient-reported outcome measure of sleep health based on local conditions affecting sleep to augment our existing self-report measures, wondering if there were specific cultural or economic conditions that might contribute to sleep deficiencies in this population. Phases 2 and 3 were then to pilot the measure and then use it in an epidemiological study looking at the relationship between sleep and chronic disease risk. So the focus groups became semi-structured individual interviews that were conducted remotely, either over the phone or over Zoom during the pandemic. We elicited the importance and meaning of sleep in local culture, community perceptions of what adequate sleep was, the perceived relationship between sleep and mental, physical, and spiritual health, the perceived facilitators and barriers to healthy sleep, and the importance of dreams for healthy sleep, whether that was considered a dimension that was important for Native folks, and community perceptions of existing sleep guidelines designed for the majority culture and barriers to adherence with those guidelines. And we also elicited the ability of pre-existing self-report measures to assess sleep-related health and behaviors in American Indian communities. The key informants, 5 people from each site, represented expert community members and those with specialized knowledge about cultural practices. These could either be health professionals or traditional medicine people. And we had a pretty good mix of both. The key informant interviews mirrored the individual interviews and included questions about sleep health, schedules, and patterns, as well as questions about cultural practices surrounding sleeping and dreaming. So when we eventually piloted the items, which I'll share with you in just a moment, they were administered to 121 people from the 3 communities. Average age was 55 years with a standard deviation of 13.5-ish. 63% of the sample was female. They were all American Indian, and 12% reported Hispanic heritage. 22% had a high school education, 24% had some college, and 16.5% were college grads. 39% did not speak their native language at all. 45% spoke a little, 8% spoke their native language moderately well, and 8% were fluent. So skipping over all the minutia details of the analysis process, it ended up, we used conventional content analysis for those of you who are familiar with it. It yielded 12 barriers to healthy sleep and 14 facilitators of healthy sleep. Of the 12 barriers and 14 facilitators, 8 barriers and 5 facilitators were unaccounted for by existing scales. So we compared the content of those facilitators and barriers to existing sleep health measures and found that there was some overlap, but there was also some unique content that came from the qualitative work. So the barriers. People reported eating before bed causing bad dreams, and that interfered with their ability to get good sleep. Thinking or worrying about family, loved ones, or loss. This was also a common theme that was not represented in the mainstream existing measures. Technology or electronics, screen time, keeping people from being able to fall asleep easily. Substance use, whether that be caffeine, coffee, prescriptions, or any other drugs, were seen as a barrier to healthy sleep, as well as alcohol use. Could have lumped those together, but they are distinct in Native communities. Oftentimes people a curious fact about Native communities, especially reservation communities, they have the highest prevalence of absolute abstinence from alcohol of any population in the US. So just a side note. Other people in the home were reported as barriers to healthy sleep. In Native communities, it's quite common to have intergenerational households where you have grandparents, parents, and children, grandchildren in the same home. And so that can pose a barrier to getting healthy, uninterrupted sleep. Work schedule or work concerns were also another category that people reported interfering with their ability to sleep well. And worry about weather or natural disasters. This was much more common in the Southern Plains, particularly in Oklahoma, as one might imagine, being tornado country. As far as facilitators of good sleep, people reported relying on ceremony or cultural practices like praying, sweat lodge, participation, smudging, use of traditional remedies or talismans. People also reported that having worked hard during the day led to better quality sleep at night. So things like physical labor, gardening, or outdoor activities were commonly cited. Expecting good dreams or looking forward to dreaming. Dreaming has a particular relevance in Native communities and cultures that is different than in mainstream culture. There were also cultural bedtime activities that were cited, storytelling with family or traditional prayer, as distinct from ceremonial practices. And then personal sleeping preferences, routines, and habits. Some people reported using white noise machines, for instance, sleeping positions, sleep aids, and so on. So these were the factors that were, again, not covered in the mainstream existing sleep measures. So what we ended up with after all of the qualitative work were two scales that didn't actually function as scales so much as checklist, because having endorsed one of the facilitators or barriers did not necessarily make it more likely that people would endorse another of the facilitators or barriers. So we did identify some unique factors affecting reservation communities. It's unclear if those factors will generalize to urban settings and populations. The measure is brief, 13 items in total. It did show good concurrent and discriminant validity when compared to the other mainstream tests, i.e. it was measuring something different than what either the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, the Insomnia Severity Index, the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, or the Stop Bang, which is a measure of the likelihood of a person having obstructive sleep apnea. It was correlated, but not very strongly with those items. And particularly the barriers part of the checklist showed stronger correlation with those measures, as higher scores on the barriers checklist was associated with worse sleep, and higher scores on those mainstream measures that I mentioned are also associated with worse sleep. It did show decent internal consistency. The item total correlations were acceptable, and it served as a good example of mixed method survey development from community input into a quantitative measure that could be used in epidemiologic research. Ooh. There we go. For any follow-up questions you might have, feel free to reach out by email. But I think the plan now is to go on to a Q&A session with all of the panelists. Is that correct, Celestine?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lonnie. Thanks for sharing your work. That was great to be able to hear from the project that I know about. I'm glad that you're able to share it with others. Thank you so much. Well, we have a lot of questions there. We had a very engaged audience watching over YouTube. So I appreciate all of everyone who submitted a question. We're going to try to just jump right in and get to as many as we can. We've got a great team here monitoring them. I'm trying to kind of pull together some themes here so we can kind of hit as many as possible. Let's start with a quick definition. When you all were talking about sleep deprivation, those of you that were noting that, what does that mean? Is that like pulling an all-nighter, or is that getting 5 hours of sleep? When you say sleep deprivation, how many hours are you talking about?
So I guess I can take that question because we have done research on that very question, and it's a great question because it's not an obvious answer, right? So if you pull an all-nighter, I think we can all agree that that's got to be sleep deprivation. But what happens if you only get like 6 hours of sleep a night, whereas you actually would need 7 or 8? Does that also count as sleep deprivation? Well, it turns out that if you do this day in, day out, and day after day after day, that you accumulate the same level of sleep loss over multiple days as you do when you have one night with no sleep whatsoever. So roughly speaking, a week of 6 hours of sleep for a person who needs 8 hours is about the same as pulling an all-nighter. So any sleep that you lose relative to what you need actually counts towards your sleep loss. It gets a lot more complicated if we dig into it a little bit deeper, but that's sort of a good way to think about it. Any hour of sleep that you're supposed to get but you're not getting counts towards your total sleep loss, and you will ultimately suffer the consequences.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hans. The next kind of group of questions are about sleep and age, really. Do you need, or I guess, sleep deprivation and the impacts of it? Does it matter how old you are? Is it harder if you're older, if you're younger? Let's talk a little bit about that one first.
So I don't mean to be the one who answers all the questions here.
That's okay.
But so this is an interesting question in part because it's one of the few cases where older people have a bit of an advantage. You don't hear this very often, but the older you get, you don't actually need less sleep when you get older, but you do suffer the consequences of sleep loss a little bit less. And the reason for that is that younger folks have this very powerful drive for sleep, in part because their brain's still developing and their sleep is actually helping them develop. And so when they start to fall asleep, they really mean it. Whereas with older people, those of us who have gotten to that age have probably noticed that pressure for sleep becomes a little bit less strong. And so the interesting advantage of that is that, yes, we suffer the consequences of sleep loss just the same. We don't experience them as strongly because our brain is not pushing for sleep as hard. So there's a little bit of an upside to being older in that sense.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about health policy. There's some great questions about that. Amanda, I'm thinking of some of the airline work, and then Lois with maybe the shifts for nurses and things like that, that I think the comment was that extreme 12-hour shift, Is there a role for public policy, additional policy? I know a lot of this is regulated, Amanda, especially with your work. Is there an additional role for public policy? Do you see things kind of coming down the road here?
I can go, and then I think Hans might jump in as well for the aviation, and then Lois. But so right now we are primarily focused on safety, though I and my team feel very strongly that health is a component of that, and we are hoping to push that in the future. But just kind of to go back, so the FRMS data collection exemption, that is actually within the regulations. So it's not within Table C, but it's in Part 117, and they allow for that exemption there. And so currently we really don't have enough data to change the regulations and include that health aspect, but that is something that we are actively working on. And then I know Hans has worked on corporate aviation as well, so.
Yeah, so there are separate regulations for aviation on demand, and so that includes business trips, but it also includes firefighting planes. It includes rescue missions, donor transplant missions, evacuation missions. All those sorts of things have special regulations because those are on-demand flights. And so basically a pilot can be called upon to fly a flight like that at any moment notice. And so, of course, it then becomes an issue of how do you manage fatigue in people that are on such schedules, right? That are unpredictable and to some extent. And there isn't a lot of expertise in the world on that topic, but it so happens that Washington State University does have that expertise to inform those decisions. So I had the honor to be on a panel for the Federal Aviation Administration to advise on the new regulations that they're trying to make for on-demand aviation. I'm happy to report that this is the first time really that those regulations are entirely science-based and science-informed. So it was a great privilege to be on that committee because we had a chance to actually infuse science into policy, which is, of course, is why we do this kind of work at the end of the day. We want to inform policy and we want to inform the public, but also the government on how to make sleep a priority, but also how to deal with it when you don't get to sleep and you still have to perform. So there's a lot more to talk about, but that's for another day.
Great, thank you. Lois, what about with your work with certain populations that you talked about?
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I love that comment about the extreme kind of 12 hours. Amazingly, 12 hours is not actually considered an extended hour shift. It's when you go above that 12 hours, that's when we start to think, so kind of more the 24s, the 48s, more along the lines of what firefighters do, what physicians can do, and so on. But yeah, I mean, regardless of shift length, there are various things to consider. From a policy perspective, unfortunately, one of the reasons that the 12s are so common in nursing is because it's convenient for the hospitals. It makes for easy scheduling, right? Likewise, and with fire, I work with a lot of departments who want to move from a 24-48, so 24 hours on, 48 hours off, to a 48-96, so 48 hours on, 96 hours off, because of this desire to have more consolidated time off. Right. So we're kind of battling various things. We're battling what's easy in terms of scheduling. We're battling sometimes what the workers want. Although, of course, there are a lot of workers that are like, no, I don't want to. I would prefer to work an 8-hour shift than a 12-hour shift because I feel terrible after about hour 9 or 10, especially when working nights. But there's a lot of moving parts. So really, we just need to continue to do these studies that just give us more and more ammunition about, okay, what is safe. If you're moving beyond that 12-hour period, you have got to implement some kind of napping opportunity, because it is not realistic or feasible for somebody to work, 24 hours, 48 hours without any sleep. It might be possible, they might be able to do it, but their increased risk of accident, injury, not to mention what they're doing to themselves, as Hans mentioned at the very beginning, what they're doing to themselves long term, in terms of even shortening their lifespan. So we just need to be mindful. We need to keep collecting evidence and just really try and understand the limits of human performance.
Thank you, Lois. Lonnie, I have a question for you. We had a question here over YouTube about students in class looking exhausted, tired. And I thought of how you talked about electronics before bed. And certainly we see, especially I think younger generations, an increase in electronic use, social media, things like that. Is there a current kind of state of the research right now with social media use or electronics before bed? I know that came up with some of your participants.
Yeah, I mean, it was a commonly referred to phenomenon in our sample, that people just weren't able to pull themselves away from the screen time. That sort of addictive quality of the social media environment, and certainly other gaming environments and things like that. People just weren't able to disconnect and kind of put the screen down for, and then they would have trouble relaxing or mentally disconnecting from the content that they may have been interacting with. And so that was commonly reported as a barrier to healthy sleep.
Great, thank you. Lois, I have actually, it might be for any of the panelists here. We had, there's quite a few questions, and we'll kind of end with this general topic. There's quite a few questions about heredity, I guess, or nature versus nurture. a heredity of sleep patterns, or the number of hours? Do we get that from our parents? Is there a biological component here? Is it just the environment that we're raised in, if we're an early riser or a night owl? Things like that. We had quite a few questions on that. Does anyone want to jump in to talk a little bit about that? Yeah, Hans, go for it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that question because, again, we have done research on that question. And so these phenomena, how much sleep you need, how you respond to sleep deprivation, the timing of your sleep, whether you're a morning type or an evening type, an owl or a lark, those are definitely highly genetically regulated. And so you inherit that from your parents, from your family. And it's remarkably difficult to train yourself to become something that you're biologically not set up to do, right? So there's a lot of, if you Google this sort of stuff, there's a lot of advice on how you can become a morning type or how you can stay up all night if you if you just really try really hard. But it turns out at the end of the day, most of those qualities are actually built in. And it's extremely hard to run it against your own biology, and it can even potentially be harmful. So I usually don't advise people to try to be something they're not. It's not going to work out very well. That's not to say that you can't overcome the need for sleep, for instance, once or twice or just occasionally. But to do this routinely is probably not a good idea because it runs against your biology, and the biology ultimately is going to win.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have one last question for each panelist here. If you can give all the viewers one tip, whether it's during travel or just daily for the best sleep, that for the healthiest us, I guess, what would that one tip be? Hans, you're unmuted.
I would say if you feel like you need to have a nap is actual sleep, take it.
Great, thank you. Amanda.
Hans just took mine.
Hans took yours. Okay, that nap.
I guess I could add a nappuccino if you want to increase alertness. You can actually do something like some caffeine, take a nap while the caffeine is sinking in, and then you can wake up for alertness. But then take your full sleep and recuperate and take another nap if necessary later after you've done the thing you need to do for alertness.
Excellent. Nappuccino. I've never heard it called that before. I love that. Lois.
Yeah, nappuccino is perfect. And definitely in the context of drowsy driving, right? If you're really, if you're worried about being drowsy, about falling asleep. I would say just generally listen to your body, pay attention to your body, really start to understand, am I a morning person? Am I an evening person? What are my individual sleep needs? What are my sleep goals? How am I going to feel better? Just pay attention to it. If you pay attention to sleep, you can actually improve your sleep.
Great. Thank you, Lois. Lonnie.
Establish a routine, regular sleep and waking times. That's my advice.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. If we did not get to your question, for those watching over YouTube, we will be able to connect you with the researchers so that we'll be able to get your question answered. So no worries about that. I want to give a big thank you to all of our researchers here, Dr. James, Dr. Van Dongen, Dr. Lamp, and Dr. Nelson. We genuinely appreciate your time and insight with us this morning. We're privileged to learn about your amazing research that you're doing. This has been so fantastic. We are doing fantastic research related to these topics here, not only on the Spokane campus, but across the state and nation, as we said before. I also want to thank Alaska Airlines, who is our sponsor for today's Wake Up With Research. Thank you very much for your continued partnership. We do have another Wake Up With Research presentation planned for February of 2024, so please be on the lookout for that. We'll send out those details for all of our guests here. And for more information, you can always go to our website here at spokane.wsu.edu. If you want to follow up with anything shared today, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll make sure, like I said, we connect you with our researchers here, with our experts here from WSU. Also, if you're a business and interested in sponsoring one of our Wake Up for Research events or any of our research events here, please also feel free to contact us and we'll be able to put up some information here. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you that are watching here, our guests. We look forward to seeing you again, and we appreciate your support in being here with us early this morning. Have a wonderful day. Stay healthy, stay safe, and go Cougs. Thank you.